Mariana, thank you so much for giving us your time and great expertise on Jerome Moross for our Jerome Moross Centenary documentary. And let's begin with how it was that Jerome Moross actually became involved in music. That's rather a big question, but I know that you can tell us all about it. How did it all start with him? How did he really become involved in music from the beginning?
Well, Moross started in music at a very young age. In fact, he himself says in interviews that he started playing the piano when he was 5, and he started composing when he was 8. And I'm not sure from whence it came, because I don't know that his parents were very musical, but he was just fascinated with music, and it was all around him in New York City. And he was born in Brooklyn, but spent most of his youth in New York City. And he was just fascinated by all kinds of music that he heard and he performed, and he just loved it. And he, as I said, he began composing very early on. He made friends with Bernard Herrmann very early on when he was in high school, and the two of them just palled around together and experienced as much music as they possibly could. Already when he was in high school, he was already composing and making friends with the avant-garde, with the various composers that were living in New York City at the time. He tells great stories in his interviews of going to Harms, which was the big music publisher in New York City at the time, and there he would encounter all kinds of different composers, and he would just soak up the atmosphere and just kind of be there experiencing what went on. So it was a lovely time, and I think he enjoyed it. And, of course, Bernard Herrmann, his father had an amazing record collection, and Moross talks about this also. And they would listen to all these records. And, of course, this was in the 20s. And then they would perform an awful lot of music together. Herrmann played the violin, and Moross played the piano, and they would read through tons and tons of music, all kinds of Strauss and Richard Strauss, and lots of European works. So this was kind of his youth. This is what he did.
Yes, and do you think that it would be correct to say that, in fact, there was really a strong European consciousness, shall we say, in him? He's famous for being the composer who, perhaps more than anybody really in his day, focused on Americana, together with Aaron Copland, of course, particularly, but focused on a kind of musical expression that so much expressed so many elements of his own country, America. But at the same time, I feel that European influences are there. And would you say it's correct to say, actually, that there was at least a very strong European consciousness in him?
You could say that there was a European foundation. I mean, he studied the classics. He went to Juilliard. He learned composition from whoever was there at the time, and orchestration and all of that. But he took that, and on top of that foundation, I believe, he kind of impressed upon it or assimilated all of this American music that was going on around him. And he talks about, of course, his big love was the theater, and he spent a lot of time playing for theater. He played the piano, he played in the orchestra pits and around town, and that music and the music from the jazz clubs and from his grandson tells this great story that he heard from his family about Moross taking his younger brother to a carousel because he wanted to hear what a carousel sounded like. And so he just kind of adapting all this music around him. But underneath that, you could say that there was a European foundation.
It's interesting how, isn't it, at that time, in his early years, he was very interested in some of the most avant-garde music that was being composed that he was hearing, and in particular, in his own country, of course, in America, Charles Ives. This was a composer whose music he loved and I think was a big influence him in his early days. So the European foundation that you very clearly described to us And also, as you also said earlier on, of course, he was listening to and absorbing so much music that was around him, and Ives, one of the most important, as at that time particularly a very avant-garde composer. So how did that happen? How did he become aware of Ives and get to know him?
Well, Moross was introduced to Ives by Henry Cowell. He had found some of Ives' music, and he talks about this in an interview. He found, I believe it was the second piano sonata in a music store, in a secondhand music store, and he took it home and started playing it. And it took him a long time to learn it, but he was just absolutely fascinated by Ives. And after he met Henry Cowell, Cowell said, well, you have to come and meet him. And I believe he took Moross and also Bernard Herrmann to meet Ives, and Ives was living in New York City at the time. And then Moross actually used to go back and visit with Ives from time to time. Sometimes he would go by himself, sometimes he would go with Herrmann. And he became very involved with Ives' music and promoting it. In fact, he talks about how he and Herrmann went to great pains to convince Copland that he should program the 114 songs at the Yaddo Festival that he had, and they impressed upon Copland that he absolutely had to include Ives, and Copland did. But Ives was a very, very big part of Moross's early years as well.
Yes, and I think the love of Ives that he had, that survived all through his life, didn't it? There was another influence at this time, very much the music of the avant-garde, of course, Arnold Schoenberg. But I don't think that he was so, shall we say, emotionally involved with Schoenberg. But in the early days of his compositional career, I think we hear some influences, don't we?
Yes, his very early works, like as in Those Everlasting Blues, I believe, on a text by Alfred Kreimborg, was one of his early, what he called Schoenbergian pieces. But he abandoned that pretty quickly. He tried that for a little bit, and I think his other work, Paens, which was first published by Cowell in the New Music series, I think that was also highly influenced by the serialists. And Moross, I think he didn't want anybody to tell him how to compose, and I think that's what he felt when he decided not to continue in that vein any longer. He said, I don't want to compose the way other people have composed. I want to compose in my own style and in what I want to do. And I think that kind of individualistic attitude is what made him so unique and so wonderful.
And don't you think it's one of the things that led him to write such diverse and individualistic music, by which I mean he didn't have a kind of formulaic style of his own at all. There's such a lot of difference between the various works. Now, after this early period of experimentation, quite soon he writes a piece that is immensely attractive and rhythmic, quite macabre in some ways, I feel, but it's very different from Those Everlasting Blues, and I think it's only 2 or 3 years afterwards, and that was Beguine. Now that's, to me, an extraordinarily, how can we say, it's a strangely beguiling kind of work. I wonder, I'm probably wrong, but I wonder whether the word Beguine, which was his invention, came somehow from the word beguiling. Probably not. But for me, it's a very beguiling work.
Yes, that's a wonderful piece, and it evokes this kind of Latin sort of atmosphere, which is terrific. And in fact, he appropriated not exactly, but some of that feel in the music for a film that he did in the 50s called The Shark Fighters, which actually is filmed in Cuba, and it takes place there. And so he uses that kind of a feel as well. But the orchestral work, Beguine, is just a wonderful piece with some very interesting and evocative orchestration.
I absolutely agree with you. And very soon after this, we have yet another work that's utterly different. A Tall Story for Orchestra. Now, if we think of Those Everlasting Blues, Beguine, and then A Tall Story for Orchestra, written in a fairly short space of time, it's almost in some ways, like three completely different composers.
Yes. Now, A Tall Story for Orchestra has an interesting background. Moross talks about the first time he went out west. He took a bus out to the West Coast, and he stopped in Albuquerque. And he was just fascinated by Albuquerque, by the vastness of it. And he talks about what a small town it was. And he said he just had to get off the bus, and he had to look around, and he was just amazed by the whole scenery, the mountains and the openness. And he said that this is what inspired him when he composed A Tall Story for Orchestra, and that he wanted to express that sense of openness and wideness and awe.
Yes, it's a wonderfully evocative piece. Space and timelessness. It really is almost a pictorial piece of music. Very much so, actually, the more I just think about it right here and now. And one could see perhaps in those early works that there is a theatrical element there, well, a pictorial and also a theatrical element. You said earlier on, of course, that his greatest love was the theatre, and he was already immersing himself very much in music of the theatre. And his first big collaboration was with another remarkable person, the choreographer Ruth Page. Now, how did that come about, and how did that lead to this extraordinary Frankie and Johnny, which I've always felt was about 20 years ahead of its time?
Well, that was a commission that actually Aaron Copland suggested Moross for that commission. And I don't know whether it was because Ruth Page had approached Copland and Copland didn't have the time or was busy with something else, but he suggested Moross for it. Copland thought very highly of Moross and thought he was a very good composer. And so I think that hooking up with Ruth Page was very fortuitous because, of course, it was something that Moross loved to do. He loved drama, and ballet was just another form of drama. And this wonderful partnership started. They did Frankie and Johnny, and then, first it was An American Pattern, which was the first ballet that he did for Ruth Page, and then the second one was Frankie and Johnny. Of course, that was very successful. And then the third one, there was a third one, Guns and Castanets, which was going to be a recasting of Bizet's Carmen, and that fell through for a variety of reasons. But it gave Moross an opportunity to work significantly with ballet, and particularly with vernacular ballet, with getting away from the traditional tales and the traditional movements, and working with more with folk narratives and more modern kinds of approaches to ballet.
Well, I think it would have challenged a ballet audience of that time pretty considerably, I think. And also, of course, it's really, in certain ways, perhaps a little bit of a successor, if I may say so, to what Kurt Weill and Bertolt Brecht were doing. But in that, what on the surface might appear to be a popular subject actually is, of course, profound, it's biting, and has this extraordinary seesaw between outrageousness and tragedy. And I feel that the music all the way through is gripping in that sense, in that balance between the popular and the terrible, really, in many ways. It's a very gripping score, don't you think?
Yes, absolutely. And you're right. It's raw right from the very beginning, where it starts with these very dissonant chords. Right away, it kind of it grabs your attention, and it takes you kind of by the shoulders and says, "Listen to this story," and it kind of continues that way. And of course, the trio of Salvation Army girls with their tambourines, which Moross kind of compared to a Greek chorus, because they do this commentary on the action that's happening, and it's all very it's very stark and very realistic. I think he didn't sugarcoat any of that with nice music. He didn't try to write nice melodies or lyrical melodies like you get in some of his other music and some of his other dramatic works like The Golden Apple and even in Ballet Ballads, but in Frankie and Johnny, it's all just human emotion and very realistic, gripping music.
Well, he was responding, wasn't he, to the story, the characters, the text, and the feeling of the place. The social feeling, the humiliation, the degradation, the violence, but also compassion. I mean, he has great compassion there, particularly for the plight of the woman. And this goes through all his music, certainly his theatre music and his film music, doesn't it? That's to say, he was responding. His musical language, his musical style, was something that came in those works as a response to the exact dramatic and human situation that he was presented with. And it's the same in the films. I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why his invention and his creativity is so interesting, that the individual works are so different. I mean, it's almost like with Verdi, you know, the Verdi operas are all so different because each subject was different, and he wrote music that was a response to the subject. If you think of the films, the difference between The Big Country and The Proud Rebel. And here, with Frankie and Johnny, he's absolutely responding to the essence of that story, the people, the situation, and the atmosphere of that place, isn't he?
Yes, yes, right. And you're right in that Moross was a dramatic composer. He loved the drama, and that's what he wanted to compose for. And if it meant startling the audience, I think that's what he did. And when you think about, actually getting back to The Proud Rebel, that opening, that main title was not actually his first choice. What he had originally intended was something a little more tender, because for Moross, I'm sorry, I'm taking this totally off topic, but for Moross, The Proud Rebel was not so much a Civil War drama as it was, or a post-Civil War drama, as much as it was a family drama. And it was the relationship with Alan Ladd and his son, and then with Olivia de Havilland. It was a sad and touching movie. He was more involved in the familial drama than he was with the war. So that main title opening wasn't what he originally composed. He actually changed that and made it that disturbing opening. But that's neither here nor there.
Yes, but that's very important for us to know. And we'll come back to films later on, of course. But staying just in this period of Frankie and Johnny now, 1938, I think. I think, Mariana, that I'm right in saying it was round about this time that he met his future wife, Hazel. I hope that's correct.
Yes, and he met Hazel when he was in Los Angeles, and unfortunately, I don't know a lot of the details. I know most of my information about Moross from his letters to Hazel and from his interviews and a couple of articles that he's written. But he was a very private person, and he never really talked about his family and Hazel in his interviews. But I do know that he was very much in love with her, and he was very happy with her, and she was very supportive in everything that he did with all his works, and even did some research for him. And when all his trips back and forth from New York to Los Angeles, she was always helping him in any way that she could.
Right, yes. New York trips to Los Angeles. And this leads us to the beginning of his association with Hollywood. He wasn't he, interested in writing films at this time? And I think I'm right in saying that Hollywood was very resistant to him. They found him, didn't they, in the early days, that is, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, they found him much too avant-garde. So that's why he started doing orchestrations before he was allowed to write music for a film. Seems hard to understand now when we know what he was able to do with that wonderful creativity, but they clearly thought he was too modern, and once again, here we go, ahead of his time.
They did. They thought he was too modern, and this is a statement that Moross said in one of his interviews, and they didn't want to, I don't know if they didn't want to hire him or they just weren't considering him as a possibility. But his first paying job in Hollywood was orchestrating for Aaron Copland. Aaron Copland came to do Our Town in 1940 and asked Moross to orchestrate it. So he did, and apparently he did well, and after that he got a few other orchestrating jobs until finally in 1942 when Warner Brothers asked him if he would work for them on an ongoing basis. So that was his first steady orchestrating job, which he did from 1942 to 45.
And it's in the early part of this period, in 1943, isn't it, that Moross, in fact, had his first symphony premiered. Do you know how it was that that came about? I mean, when he started first thinking of actually writing a symphony?
Moross was invited to compose a work for radio, a program that John Lomax did on folk music in the air for children, something like that. And they asked Moross to contribute a piece, and he did. He contributed a work that actually John Lomax suggested he use Midnight Special, the song. And he did. He composed a work based on that, and he called it Ramble on a Hobo Tune. And that work eventually became the third movement of his symphony. And his symphony is a really interesting piece because, like most of Moross, it's very thoughtfully constructed. The first movement is a theme and variations, for example. The last movement is an invention. And it's all, but it's the tunes the melodies that he writes for it are all very accessible and very lyrical and lovely. And plunked in the middle of that is the piece that was Ramble on a Hobo Tune. But you can't recognize Midnight Special in there because it's deeply buried. So it's not like it's recognizable. But it's interesting that it provided kind of the foundation or the spark for the first symphony, that this song, it actually started that.
Well, that's very important what you say there, because it shows us something that's vital about Moross. Now, he had in common with many of the most important composers of the early part of the 20th century. I'm thinking of Bartók, Janáček, and Stravinsky. But in common with these people who were very interested in folk music, the ancient folk music of their country, and these composers made a new kind of modern music by taking ancient but original, indigenous, I should say, folk music elements, not folk music elements that have been softened up over the years, but the indigenous, original folk music elements, and structured them in a new way for modern music. And I think Moross did this in the United States, in American music, because he had such a wonderful grasp of form and structure. He was so disciplined, he was so concerned with form, and I think that's one of the reasons why what you've told us is important, that it works so well in the First Symphony, particularly, that he has taken really indigenous, strong, quite rough and powerful American folk roots, but he's moulded them into a strong symphonic form, but in a modern way with modern musical sounds, modern orchestration, contemporary harmonies. And I think that's why it works so well.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's that he talks about when you put a formal structure like that on music, it makes it easier to listen to and makes it more accessible. And I think there he was thinking about his audiences, because he always particularly wanted to write music that audiences would like and that they would want to listen to again and again. And ultimately, I think he succeeded, because if you listen to any of his instrumental pieces, his chamber works, they're all very accessible and lovely to listen to.
Yes, they are, aren't they? I love the miniatures, if you can call them that, some of the smaller scale things he wrote, which have a perfect symmetry in the way that they contain such melodic invention. I mean, that is something very special in his music, I think. Well, Mariana, how is it that Jerome Moross became involved really with John Latouche? Because Ballet Ballads, which of course began its life in one respect with Susanna and the Elders in 1941, but came to its full fruition after the end of the Second World War. I think if we look at Ballet Ballads as a whole, around about 1946, that was the next major happening in Moross's life. How is it that he'd managed to find John Latouche and that they became such vital collaborators?
Well, I've been looking at this a lot lately, and the only time he mentions his friendship with, or the origins of his friendship with Latouche, is that he says they met briefly in 1935. Now, I suspect that given both of their love for the theater, this is probably where their paths crossed. At some point they met casually, as Moross says, in 1935. And then in 1938 they met again. And I think that was when they started talking more. And I have absolutely no evidence of this, no tangible evidence. But they probably at that point started talking about Ballet Ballads and the first scenario in that, which is Susanna and the Elders. And they started concocting this new form of ballet, which involved singing and dancing and folk narratives, narratives that are well known. And they started talking about that. So by 1941, Susanna and the Elders was composed, and it was actually premiered in Hollywood. But that was when their relationship first started, and I think they were wonderfully compatible because Latouche had this wonderful knack of writing poignant lyrics that contemporized, if you will, some well-known narratives from before. I'm thinking here particularly of Riding Hood Revisited, and also The Eccentricities of Davy Crockett, both of which are in Ballet Ballads. And Latouche, he updated those stories, and with a whimsical sense of humor that Moross picked up on when he wrote the music. And so it all comes through in both so nicely. They mesh together. And then Golden Apple is just even more an extension of Latouche's textual finesse and Moross's lovely, impeccable melodies kind of bound together in a great story. I wish someone would perform it again so we could have a good recording of the entire thing.
Well, now, by the time of the premiere of The Golden Apple, 1954, now Moross was writing film scores, and Hollywood had understood and realized what an extraordinary film composer he was. He didn't write, did he, at all, in the regular way that people like Max Steiner and other composers in Hollywood were writing. He wasn't a regular Hollywood composer. Again, I go back to what I said earlier on. He responded always, didn't he, to the character, the text, the feeling, the place, the whole story. I'm not saying other film composers didn't, but he particularly was inspired by that. And at this time, he was beginning to write more films of importance.
Well, the projects that he really appreciated were kind of the off-the-beaten-path ones, the unusual ones. For example, he was asked to compose a part of a section for a Cinerama production, which was called Seven Wonders of the World. And he absolutely thoroughly enjoyed doing that. He and two other composers were each given chunks of that to score. And he liked that. He also very much enjoyed orchestrating the Little Mermaid ballet in the film Hans Christian Andersen with Danny Kaye. And Moross really enjoyed a challenge, and when they asked him to orchestrate some pieces by Liszt as part of that scoring for the ballet, he jumped at the opportunity, and he was so excited because he said nobody has ever orchestrated these particular pieces by Liszt, and they said it couldn't be done, but I've done it. So he enjoyed doing that as well. There were some films that he liked scoring better than others, and he wasn't shy about saying that the last three films he did, he only did them because his apartment had gone condo, and so he needed some cash. But then he was done in Hollywood. He just couldn't take it anymore. But he did enjoy some of the films that he did. He enjoyed very much composing the score for Rachel, and of course The Proud Rebel. He was very excited about scoring The Proud Rebel. He wrote to Hazel and said, "This, sweetie, could be it for me in Hollywood. This is a great movie. It's better than High Noon. It's better than Gunfight at the OK Corral, and it's got some wonderful sentiments running through it, and I'm so excited to be composing the music for this. It's going to be great." And of course, it didn't do very well. unfortunately. But it gave him practice for what he did next, which was The Big Country, and that was and is a phenomenal score.
And yet, despite the huge success of The Big Country, he didn't stay that long, did he, writing music for films? He, as you said, got tired of it. It was too much, I imagine, a matter of getting to the point where he was not doing what he really wanted to do. He had been doing what he wanted to do, but he probably could not put up with the amount of restrictions and instructions that came from the industry to him. I think that's very important because it shows how much he was his own man and how artistic inspiration was the priority, not money. He could have stayed in Hollywood and made a lot of money, but he chose not to. There is an interview we have, which we have found in the Other Minds archive, where he refers to this, and it's rather touching, actually. He just says, rather casually, well, I wanted to write for myself. I just wanted to write what I wanted to write, so I left all that behind. And this is something that is very important because we hear, don't we, in all the later, well, in all his works, that he is really writing for himself. Even when he was writing for Hollywood, he was writing for himself. But I find that intimacy and humility very, very touching,
Yes, and you can see that in the last set of works that he composed in the chamber works, that he was writing this just for the pure joy of writing. It's interesting because in towards the end of his life, his first love was the theater and drama, and that seemed to be consistent throughout his entire life. But at the end, he said, "I'm just going to do this for me," and so he turned to the strictly instrumental pieces, the chamber music.
Yes, there was some wonderful gems then in that genre. Something that I only discovered very recently in the process of doing this centenary work for the documentary, and that's the Piano Quartet. Now that is a really, I think, touchingly beautiful piece, which came, I think, didn't it, originally out of, or at least he used material from, I should say, the film Forget-Me-Not.
It's a very touching piece, and if you see the original film, it's a very short film that he wrote that for, and it's a very touching film. It's very sad, and that comes across so nicely in that melody, and he does such wonderful things, creative ways of reiterating the melody and varying it through the entire quintet. It's a lovely piece.
And then he wrote a piece in this instrumental era, the end of his life really, or the last part of his life I should say. Now, the Sonata for Piano Duet and String Quartet. I don't know of anybody else who has written that combination of instruments. Do you?
You could be right. I don't know. But it's a lovely combination, and again, Moross was able to manipulate the instruments, or not manipulate, but tease out of them these wonderful melodies and harmonies, and the way they combine, the way they work together to bring about the whole piece. It's a lovely timbre. It's a great sonority.
And then we get almost to the end of his life, and he writes an opera. Well, in some ways he had written an opera in The Golden Apple, but he writes now Sorry Wrong Number, a very dramatic, pithy, atmospheric, scary piece. Extraordinary, with a concentrated dramatic power. If only he'd lived longer, because he was going to do more opera, wasn't he?
Yes. Well, the thing that's interesting to me about Sorry Wrong Number is that Moross was very pleased that he was working with prose for the first time. He said, this is the first time I'm actually setting prose rather than, short stanzas, that this was actually kind of a challenge for him because he hadn't done that before. So he's very pleased with that. But that's frankly all I can say about Sorry Wrong Number, because I don't know it at all, other than the fact that it was written by Bernard Herrmann's ex-wife.
Oh, it's a scary piece. It came out of a radio play, and it's a bedridden woman who overhears on the phone, accidentally, she gets a crossed line and overhears a murder being planned. And to cut a long story short, it ends up that she is going to be the person who's going to be murdered. And, it makes its way through very, very dramatic psychological tension with, very interestingly, you see virtually no action. It's all in the mind. It's all her fears that build up more and more and more as she tries every possible way to prevent this happening and fails in the very last minute. And it takes us back in a sort of way to, when I say this, Frankie and Johnny, it doesn't stylistically at all, but it takes us back to the essence of Moross, that he was able to write music for subjects that could be very, very directly very confrontational. And on the other hand, we know him to be such a wonderfully lyrical, spiritual composer. Look at the last work that was written not long after Sorry, Wrong Number, the Flute Concerto. I find it one of the most gloriously warm, sunny. It's a celebration of all that's beautiful in life. And he could write that at the same time almost as writing Sorry, Wrong Number. And I think that's one of the most important qualities of Moross. And in this Flute Concerto, don't you think we have some of his personality in this? These interviews that we've got of him, he comes across as such a sweet human being, strong, and very, very absolutely down to earth with his views, and enormously educated and eloquent and elegant. But there's a sweetness. He's touching. There seems to be no ego there. There seems to be a man who just loves the beautiful things in life. And I feel that quality comes through, in the Flute Concerto.
Yes, I agree. I love exactly what you said. He was a very warm composer. He wrote amazing melodies. I can't say enough about the lyrical lines that weave themselves through all of his works are just, they just grab you. The CD that came out, Windflowers, that has all those lovely songs kind of pulled out from here and there, just one after the other, is just an incredible gem.
And Mariana, the Flute Concerto, I don't think it was a commission, was it?
I think he did it for his own pleasure, and in fact, he talks about how it started as it started as a chamber work, and he added flute to it, and the flute part got larger and larger and expanded until it got to the point where it actually became a flute concerto. But it started life out as something different, something a little smaller, and wasn't intended initially to be a flute concerto, but that's what it evolved into.
Well, Mariana Whitmer, thank you so much for giving us your very, very extensive insights and tremendous knowledge into Jerome Moross for our Jerome Moross centenary. It's wonderful, actually, to hear your love of this composer, which is as strong as mine is, and as strong as all our contributors, and long overdue to have recognition of his maverick qualities. This interview with you is extremely important in that direction. Thank you very, very much indeed for speaking with us for the Jerome Moross centenary.
Well, thank you.